Good afternoon and welcome to the BAFSA webinar. Today we have three experts examining the subject of automatic fire sprinklers in care homes and supported living developments. Please ask questions in the Q&A tab at any stage. Our first poll of the day asks, do you have automatic fire sprinklers installed in any of your establishments? Now, here is the premiere of the latest animation from BAFSA, followed by Keith McGillivray, Chief Executive of BAFSA.
Many of us will come to depend on the provision of residential care for ourselves or a loved one. Automatic fire sprinklers provide enhanced protection from fire for everybody, particularly those living in care homes and supported living developments, those who are vulnerable because of age, physical or psychological conditions, and are dependent on the care and attention of others, especially in an emergency such as a fire. Automatic fire sprinklers provide those who have mobility or other challenges a greater chance of escaping a fire safely, with or without assistance. Is it unreasonable for a vulnerable child or adult to know they are living in a fire-safe environment, sleeping soundly in their beds, safe in that knowledge? We don't think so. Install automatic fire sprinklers in care homes and supported living developments, and put a firefighter in every room ready to fight a fire at source 24/7, providing vital reassurance for residents, their families and their carers.
Good afternoon, a very warm welcome to the latest BAFSA seminar. This time we're looking at care homes and sheltered housing and the differences between the countries of the UK and why you should fit sprinklers into care homes. My name is Keith McGillivray. I'm the Chief Executive of BAFSA. I was previously in the fire service and have been with BAFSA for the last 12 years. Fires in care homes is one of the main reasons that I support sprinklers being fitted into care homes, and I'll talk about my experiences with that later on in the presentation. So in the United Kingdom, we are 4 countries and we have an elderly and vulnerable aging population. So what are we doing to protect this population in the UK? Particularly in care homes, sheltered housing and specialised housing. What you will see in my presentation is that the standards are very different between the 3 devolved nations and England. So we have 4 devolved administrations: Northern Ireland, Scotland, England and Wales, all part of the United Kingdom. So it's one country, it's 4 governments, but it's 4 standards as well. 4 different building standards for the UK, but the same standard for sprinklers. The British standard for sprinklers applies throughout the 4 devolved administrations. In Scotland, it's been a requirement to install fire sprinkler systems in all new built care homes and sheltered housing since 2005. The Scottish Government introduced this requirement in part due to its response to the Rose Park care home fire of 2004, in which 14 residents died. This was a road to Damascus moment for myself. I attended that fire, and I'll talk more about that later in the presentation. In Wales, it's been a requirement to fit sprinklers in all new built care homes and sheltered housing since 2014. This was following a long campaign from Anne Jones, a member of the Welsh Assembly and a former fire officer, and people like BAFSA, the National Fire Sprinkler Network, European Fire Sprinkler Network and others, in trying to encourage Welsh Government to fit sprinklers, not just in care homes, but in all housing and schools as well. In England and Northern Ireland, there is no requirement to fit sprinklers in care homes, nor is there any requirement to fit sprinklers in housing or in schools, unlike Scotland and Wales. A very recent survey of the mobility of residents in care homes found that 14.4% of all residents are completely immobile. Therefore, they require staff assistance. 25% of residents can walk unaided. 24% of residents use a wheelchair, and 35.6% of residents use a walking aid. And this is something you should consider if you have a care home and you're running a care home. What is the mobility of the population of your care home? And have you done a PEEPS for each individual member or each member resident who lives there? And does that take account of how they will evacuate from the care home? In the same study, they looked at evacuation, and 10.2% of the occupants were able to self-evacuate. The remainder required staff assistance. Now, this was taken over, the survey was taken over 90 care homes in England, and this was the outcome. So something to consider is how many staff you will have on duty should the fire alarm go off and you're required to evacuate the care home. And we have seen various cases in the past where there are very small numbers of staff and they have been unable to evacuate all the residents successfully. This is me back in 2004 at a care home fire just outside Glasgow, the Rose Park Care Home. Sadly, 14 residents died in this care home fire. It was a very small fire, but a very large care home. There was about 60 residents in the care home at the time. The small fire started in an electrical cupboard and then spread to the corridor. The alarm did actuate, but due to various procedures, the staff were unaware that the fire had occurred. The alarm was then reset, and on the second time, the fire service was called. Unfortunately, by the time the fire service arrived, all 14 residents were already dead. The majority of these residents died from smoke inhalation, not from the direct fire. The fire didn't spread far beyond the corridor and the cupboard of origin. A survey was done by the Scottish Government, which included a full-scale reproduction of the care home, which they set on fire on 4 occasions. On one occasion, it was fitted with sprinklers, and it was found that had sprinklers been fitted, then it's likely that all 14 residents would have survived. Similarly, if all fire and smoke stop doors had been closed at the time of the fire, it is likely that the majority of the residents would also have survived. However, it took 5 years for the results of this inquiry and the research to be publicised. We were very fortunate in Scotland that we already had a sprinkler bill on the statute book, which with all party agreement, we were able to get reenacted or get acted on very quickly. And in 2005, it became a requirement for all care homes in Scotland to have sprinklers fitted to them. Unfortunately, this was only for new built care homes and not retrofit. The care home, the Rose Park Care Home, was only 10 years old, so it was a modern care home with all the fire precautions that should be in it. However, this was the outcome when the doors were left open. So it really was a changing moment for me and made me support the campaign to fit sprinklers in all care homes and in many other premises, and also started my work with BAFSA. This is a care home in Inverness. Again, not an old care home. This one is only 10 years old. At 6 p.m. at night, a small fire started in the care home and it spread to the roof space. There were 59 residents in the care home at the time. All were having their dinner. There was also 12 members of staff. As soon as the fire alarm actuated, the staff began the evacuation of all of the residents. At the same time, the fire service were called and were there very quickly with 40 firefighters in attendance. So with the help of the firefighters, the staff and neighbours from the nearby housing, they were able to evacuate all 59 of the residents from the care home. But sadly, the care home itself was destroyed. What you must consider is, had this fire occurred in the middle of the night, when staff numbers would have been lower, the fire service response might not have been as quick, the neighbours may not have been available, would all 59 residents have got out of the care home successfully? Somehow I don't think it would. The damage to the care home, you can see it was completely destroyed. The residents lost all their belongings, all their cherished memories, etc. The care home was never rebuilt. It was demolished but never rebuilt. So this is what happens when it all goes wrong. If you fit fire sprinklers into a care home or into sheltered housing or specialised housing, the sprinklers give you more time to escape. It enables you to assist those who require assistance to get out, who can't get out by their own unaided efforts. You must ensure when you carry out your fire risk assessment of your care home or sheltered housing that you do consider the fitting of sprinklers. You must ensure when you carry out your PEEPS assessment of the residents that you take account of their ability to escape by their own unaided efforts. If you have any doubts about this, then you should consider fitting sprinklers. And I would also urge the English and Northern Ireland governments to fit sprinklers in care homes. They should make it a requirement both to fit it in new built care homes and also retrofit existing care homes. Thank you very much for your time and listening to our presentation. We have another 2 speakers to follow me, and I'm sure you'll find that their input is equally well worth listening to, particularly the technical requirements of fitting sprinklers into care homes. Thank you.
Could you now join us for a brief Q&A, Keith? But before that, here are the results of our first poll. We asked, do you have automatic fire sprinklers installed in any of your establishments? 51% of you said yes, and 49% of you said no. Thank you for that. There will be another one later. So Keith, we're asked, can you elaborate on how sprinklers benefit those with incapacities in the event of a fire?
The sprinklers either extinguish the fire or control the fire in the early stages. This allows more time for the residents to escape from the building and allows the staff more time to assist them to get out as well. It should confine the fire to the one room where it has started by the actuation of the sprinklers and control it there, thus allowing everybody else to get out in time.
Thank you. We've also been asked, will it be difficult for our residents to escape if all the sprinklers are actuating?
Under normal circumstances, only one sprinkler head will actuate where the fire has started. Obviously, if this fire does spread more, then one by one the sprinkler heads will go off. They never all actuate at once, and it is seldom that more than 1 or 2 sprinkler heads actuate. So therefore people can escape quite easily and are not impeded by any water or anything from the sprinkler system.
Thanks very much, Keith. We'll see you later.
Thank you.
And now Ian Goff, Technical Advisor to BAFSA, will do his presentation.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Ian Goff. I am the Technical Advisor to the British Automatic Fire Sprinkler Association. However, I did serve for just about 32 years in the fire service before I joined BAFSA, and have some experience of dealing with fires and fire safety in care homes and other types of residential care. To start off the presentation today, I'd like you to contrast and compare 2 photographs of 2 fires. Both I feel is quite important, certainly in the evolution of my experience and knowledge and understanding of residential fire sprinklers. And in fact, the one particular fire I actually attended. 27 Campion Court, Northampton is one of those incidents that I think will always be in my memory, a very sad event. Back in 1997, where a fairly typical modern 3-storey townhouse owned by the local council suffered a terrible fire. A little boy playing with matches basically set fire to a sofa. So we had a mother and 2 young children were fatally injured at that fire. The important thing that I want to point out to everyone is that building complied with the building regulations. Not just the building regulations of the time, but if that was built today, it wouldn't have anything more than what it had. So it would comply with today's building regulations. And I'd just like you to think that just because your buildings comply with the building regulations, it doesn't necessarily mean that they are safe and that people won't suffer serious injury or worse in a fire. The other important thing to point out in this fire, as it is with all 3-storey or multi-storey properties, and even single-storey properties, if we're looking at care homes, is that the fire protection of the occupants relied upon fire-resisting doors. And quite frankly, the fire-resisting doors in that building did not do their job. I felt at the time there must be a better way, and it was that started me looking at residential sprinklers. Move forwards quite a few years, and we're into 2013. This is a homeless person's hostel down in Cardiff. Again, vulnerable people like there was in Campion Court. The tenant locked himself into his room, set fire to his clothes. Those of you that are perhaps responsible for this type of occupancy may be familiar with that situation. I've certainly been to other fires where that's happened. Young offender institutions is one example. However, in this case, when the building was either constructed or renovated, I'm not sure which, good sense was had and sprinklers were installed. And the sprinkler head operated. And if you can see, very little damage, a little bit of water damage to the carpet, a bit of ash on the floor. No injuries sustained. The premises were quickly back in use, and no problems to the fire brigade. Although the door was locked, the staff couldn't get in. The fire brigade were able to break down the door and remedy the situation. At that time, sprinklers were not required in Wales, but only a few weeks later, in the final vote in the Welsh Assembly, this sprinkler success was used by the minister responsible for the legislation to really push through the law in Wales. And if you don't know, all homes in Wales, newly built, must now have sprinkler protection. And we might touch on that a bit later on. So just to reinforce the message, is that our traditional methods of fire protection is based on protecting people outside of the room of origin. Certainly the fire doors on this bedroom door did nothing to protect the person inside that room who would actually set fire to his clothes and his belongings. Also back in around about 1997, following a lot of pressure from the United States, a number of fire and rescue services in the UK said, well, let's look at residential sprinklers. What's this all about? And the big question is always, do they work? After all, if we're responsible for vulnerable people in places such as care homes and other institutions, we need to be sure that if we're stepping outside the traditional building standards approach, that we've got it right. And so Cleckheaton Council, in conjunction with West Yorkshire Fire Service, decided to set up a trial, or a number of trials, with residential sprinklers. And these are a few stills from that event. Fortunately, they had a tower block that was due for demolition, so they could do some testing. And it's always important, of course, that we can mirror tests. So we had sprinklered and we had unsprinkled rooms, and a number of fire scenarios were put together. Clearly, in the unsprinkled property, such as that example there, you would not have survived the fire. The temperatures and the atmosphere was being monitored by the building research establishment, and you would not have been able to survive that fire had you not been able to get off the sofa. In the other situation, exactly the same room, exactly the same furniture, exactly the same fire, but with a sprinkler system, the sprinkler operated and enabled a person to survive that fire. So the temperature didn't rise sufficiently to burn anyone. And most importantly, the toxic gases and smoke would not have overcome anyone that was unfortunate enough to be trapped in that room. As you can see, small amount of damage to the chair, bit of water damage on the floor. So a very successful set of tests. Unfortunately, there was no official document published following these tests, but it did set other people thinking, and it also set government thinking. The most important point, I think, that came from the Cleckheaton test is that the results showed that the persons in the room of origin could survive the effects of a fire if a sprinkler system is installed. And we didn't know that before. So this was an important milestone on the journey to us now seeing sprinklers in a lot more types of residential properties. And just to back that case study up, this is a real fire in the USA, in Arizona. Quite a challenging fire for a sprinkler system because someone was asleep on the bed, as you can see that's damaged there. And his partner threw petrol on him, ignited the petrol, the sprinkler operated, extinguished the fire, and the victim was left with minor burns. The culprit went to prison for life. So that's quite a challenge to see a petrol fire, deliberate petrol fire started in a room and the sprinkler system perform better than one might expect. Again, back around the late 1990s, John Craig was the chief of Wiltshire, had been to the USA and seen what was going on there and also in Canada. And he eventually persuaded a housing association on a new build site to install sprinklers in the entire estate, and hence Studley Green came to prominence. We have a total of 212 properties ranging from one-person flats to eight-person houses, and that would include sheltered houses, and increasingly now we use the term supported living. So there was a variation of residents on that estate, many of whom one could class as vulnerable. Something to bear in mind for designers and enforcing authorities is these properties were all direct main connections. That means the water supply came straight from the town main in the street, which results in the fact that you don't need a tank or a pump. And therefore, those systems are very cost effective and very reliable. Be careful of dealing with your water supplier. In the past, water companies were not so enthusiastic about sprinklers and certainly direct main connections that may have to bypass the water meter as a fire connection. But increasingly, we're finding water companies very supportive. After all, a fire sprinkler is going to use a lot less water than a firefighter's hose. And proof of the pudding, we've had a number of fires on Studley Green. This is one example that I think is worth considering. Again, a very challenging fire in an outside shed. I think it's a washing machine or tumble dryer. So white goods in the shed, electrical fire. You can see it's burnt through the back door of the property and spread into the building. Fortunately, the sprinkler performed better than expected, stopped the fire in its tracks, and the resultant damage was fairly minimal. Importantly, and again, having experienced as a fire officer visiting properties such as residential care homes where they've suffered a fire, I understand the difficulties in decanting people to other premises whilst the property is put back into use. Here, is a good example where the property remained occupied whilst the repairs were carried out. But government don't like to do anything based on just other people's views, and certainly not industry's views, or even the fire and rescue services views. They need to have a cost-benefit analysis to show that any changes in legislation is going to bring value for money. And so they commissioned the Building Research Establishment to almost revisit the Cleckheaton trials, but also look at a cost-benefit analysis on installing residential sprinklers in all different types of residential properties. And as part of this analysis, there were a number of fire tests carried out, and anybody that's having to make a case for installing sprinklers really needs to refer to this document, published back in February 2004, with a lot of good information, particularly on the real fire tests. And one thing I should mention is Scotland, following these trials, decided to make it mandatory for sprinklers to be in care homes. England and Wales at that time simply tried to encourage people to install sprinklers in residential care homes. And I'll give some examples of that later on. But the other lesson perhaps I ought to mention is, whilst, and we can talk about this later on, fire sprinklers can result in perhaps relaxations of other forms of fire protection, these trials pointed out and really emphasised the need to maintain smoke detection. What a sprinkler cannot do is extinguish a fire before it's really grown, more so than what a smoke detector would detect. So it's important that slow smouldering fires are still detected by automatic fire detection, and then the sprinkler system is there to actually deal with any flaming fire that could really cause the problem. So when do we need to install sprinklers? Both building regulations and the fire safety order are supported by guidance documents. And this is the same in all parts of the UK. We approach fire safety in the UK in three different ways, or there's three strategies. You approach it by using the general approach, using approved documents and the technical handbooks. Technical handbooks are in Scotland and Northern Ireland. An advanced approach using British Standard 9999, which is a form, it's a mid-route really, a form of fire engineering. And then we use BS 7974 for the most complicated buildings. I think all the audience today will not be dealing with BS 7974 fire safety engineered buildings, but certainly the vast bulk of care and residential properties use the approved documents and the technical handbooks. Occasionally, the use of BS 9999 comes into play. It's important to bear in mind that even the building regulations approved document B or the technical handbooks do not amount to a set of statutory requirements. They don't have to be followed. If you wish to design and construct your building in a different way, so long as you can prove that your building still satisfies the main regulations, you're entitled to do so. The difficulty is in proving that your system or your approach will work. So in England and Wales, we have two documents now, volume 1 and 2. Volume 1 is purely for dwellings, volume 2 is for the whole range of everything else, quite frankly. And as I've mentioned already, we have BS 9999. And also a useful document is BS 9991 for residential buildings. And there are some subtle differences in that can make life easy for developers and people building new properties. The legislation doesn't wish to close the door on innovative systems. There's always a pressure when new products come onto the market to get them approved. Of course, building regulations need to ensure that those systems and items are fit for purpose, and therefore great care needs to be taken whether they're approved or not. But we are allowed to use other products, provided again we can prove that they will do the job. I need to make mention of changes to the approved document in regards to flats, because increasingly we are seeing high-rise care buildings of all sorts. As more and more footprints are becoming tighter, we are building upwards. So now, following the changes that's come about after Grenfell Tower, no longer are we just seeing high-rise buildings fitted with sprinklers. Flats over 30 metres have had a requirement to fit sprinklers since 2007. We now have to look at flats over 11 metres in height. Of course, it's no longer strictly relevant to Wales, this section of our approved document, because all flats in Wales must be protected with sprinklers. Or I should emphasise, all new flats. The Welsh legislation is not retrospective. Something I want to mention in conjunction with this, and it does apply to all sorts of other premises, is there's often a desire to only protect certain parts of the building by sprinklers. This is a bad idea. It's a bad fire engineering approach, because there is always the risk that a fire can start in an unprotected area and move into the protected area. And if it does that, there's the risk of it overwhelming the sprinklers. And frustratingly, our building standards or building regulations guidance does allow common parts such as stairways and corridors not to be protected. But I'd like you to think about that for a moment. Just looking at what we're talking about when we look at where we install sprinklers. We really want to install sprinklers in every part of the building. That would include the loft space, as this diagram shows. But there are exemptions, certainly for dwellings. Increasingly, we don't put sprinklers in loft spaces because of there's issues of freezing, and of course the height at which water might have to get. If we've simply got water coming from the town main, then the pressure might not be adequate. So there is the ability to not cover everywhere with sprinklers, but you need to be careful. And I would point out that the fire strategy or the risk assessment needs to carefully consider any parts of the building that are not protected. I also should say that the same view is taken by the Welsh legislation. So if you're building something in Wales and you look at the legislation, that also talks about not protecting the common parts. But I know for a fact that many of us that have served as firefighters are only too familiar with fires in stairway enclosures and corridors because somebody's dumped a three-piece suite there, or bags of rubbish that someone then has gone and ignited. So be very careful of not protecting the common parts of blocks of flats. And this is, I think, a very good example of what I'm trying to say. This is a care home in Scotland. This care home very fortunately had a sprinkler system installed, and it successfully suppressed a fire in a bathroom, would you believe? So far, so good. What struck me as particularly interesting was having viewed these photographs from Strathclyde Fire Service that shows the roof void, and that roof void has no sprinklers. Now, I don't think you need to be a fire engineer to realise that with the amount of combustible timber in that roof void, had the fire started up there rather than actually in the bathroom with no sprinkler protection, that fire would have overwhelmed the roof and the sprinklers would have been rendered totally useless. So be very careful of unprotected areas, and also in care homes, if you are having a form of, I'll use the term stay put or delayed evacuation, you really should be protecting all of the building structure. While I'm on the topic of being careful, even when you have sprinklers installed, this is increasingly a problem that we've seen in all sorts of premises, particularly residential premises, where we are paying far more attention, quite rightly, to fire stopping and fire seals around pipes and other openings. This photograph shows a sprinkler CPVC pipe through a fire barrier. and clearly somebody that doesn't know what they're doing has come along after the installer has fitted the sprinklers and tried to fill up the hole with some form of mastic. That mastic has melted the pipe, and you see the water damage there to the wall. Increasingly, this is becoming a problem, and it is contractors not understanding the importance of having the correct products to seal around sprinkler pipes. Any sprinkler contractor who is competent will know about that and will even offer to do the job themselves. But the way the building industry seems to work is this is often given to somebody else towards the end of the project to go and fill in a few holes and use whatever they want. So be careful. We mentioned really there are great opportunities to install sprinklers where you can relax in other areas, and BAFSA in conjunction with Arup produced this report, in fact back in 2006, and this picks up on a number of opportunities already established within regulations or guidance, statutory guidance, where sprinklers can be used as a compensating feature in both approved document B and even BB 100, the school's guidance document. And it's well worth looking at this so that you get the best value for money really from any sprinkler system you're considering installing before you build your building. And we can do things like, particularly I think relevant to care homes would be extending travel distance. So you might not need so many fire exits. You can have longer corridors. You can have rooms within rooms, and we'll talk about that a bit later on. So there are opportunities here in all sorts of residential and other types of buildings where sprinklers can add value and help perhaps with a more innovative or more flexible design. And here's a case that our UK or sort of English government acknowledges is in care homes. This is guidance now in the approved document B for England, and we now require minimum of 3 protected areas, no more than 10 beds in a protected area. We need door closing devices on bedroom doors, and under our current approved document B, we're asking for free swing door closers, which can be quite expensive. However, within the document, it gives you the option where a sprinkler system is provided, you can relax on door closers to bedrooms, which can be a great benefit to elderly people or frail people who often do struggle with trying to open doors with a fire closer on it. And we can have more than 10 beds in a protected area. So this gives some flexibility to those who are designing and constructing or extending existing care homes. But the other thing that I find with talking to people in the care sector that they find quite attractive is the issue of making life easier for their emergency plan. All properties, as you know, must have an emergency plan. How do we get people out in the event of a fire? And in many ways, it's how do we get people out if the fire alarm goes off? And I won't dwell on false alarms too much, but we all know that that can cause a problem. Although there's nothing in the building regulations, in the guidance for England and Wales for residential care, there is the opportunity to allow for delayed evacuation. So if a sprinkler system is installed in your care home, you can have a much easier approach to emergency evacuation because you can take account of that sprinkler system. I emphasize that's subject to a suitable and sufficient fire risk assessment, so be careful. But I see a lot of care providers making use of sprinklers to even have something akin to a stay put policy. And that's not just BAFSA saying that. There is statutory issues here to consider, and in all parts of the UK, this was a change that came about again in the mid-90s. You can accept an automatic form of fire suppression instead of the manual form of fire suppression. In other words, instead of having large heavy extinguishers or hose reels, you might say, well, we'll utilise the sprinkler system to extinguish or suppress any fire. Again, I emphasise that's subject to a risk assessment. And I know that's controversial to many. And quite frankly, I would not advise you removing all your fire extinguishers. But I do think in certain areas you might be able to have a smaller size of fire extinguisher to make sure that all members of staff can actually handle them. Interesting sometimes when you look back at things that have been done in the past and then forgotten about. This is a guidance document for, it's probably the most appropriate document now for what we might call supported living or care in the community. We used to call them halfway homes years ago. This is a document produced by NHS Estates, of course, which no longer exists. And back then, they accepted that you could have an open plan staircase, provided you have a sprinkler system. That tells me that, well, in a lot of our two-storey properties, rather than having to enclose the staircase, perhaps if we have a sprinkler system, the enforcing authorities would accept that. And I am seeing that as again, an attraction to installing these systems. Other opportunities, I see a lot of interest in open plan living. It wasn't the case years ago, but everywhere we want open plan living. And the questions often come up about open plan flats. This is a piece of work carried out by the National House Building Council about open plan flat layouts and what's the best form of protection. And I'll just pick out one particular example here from quite a heavy document. And it's an example of a 3-bedroom flat. That layout complies with the approved document B. So building regulations would say, yeah, that's fine. And basically we have a corridor and we have our smoke detector in the corridor. But we've still got a number of doors that we are having to get through to get out of any of our bedrooms or the room of origin of a possible fire. If we can do that, is that possible? What's the best form of protection? As you can see, that's a much larger flat. It'd be much easier access for all types of people, particularly perhaps people in wheelchairs. And the research showed that provided there was a sprinkler system and additional smoke detectors, so we put additional smoke detectors in each bedroom, and to hardwire a smoke detector into a bedroom isn't going to cost a lot of money. That is at least as good as what the current guidance to the building regulations is recommended. And once again, we are seeing developers want to install sprinklers, and they're finding it is actually a benefit to install sprinklers. The cost is lost in the ability to have this open plan arrangement. So it's something else to think about. And just to show that this has been approved, although this is the Athletes Village down in Stratford, so we're away from care homes perhaps, but 18 of the tower blocks there were all built as open plan with sprinklers. But there's often still lessons to be learned. And something that saddened us was that those flats in Stratford didn't have the underground car park protected. And that was a shame, despite the lessons we're starting to learn from fires in car parks, both here and abroad. This is a fire in a residential care home, or probably the better description would be sheltered housing flats in Bristol back in 2006. And there were 22 cars in the car park underneath the block where a fire started. The fire went through the entire car park, destroyed every car, and frighteningly went up the outside of the building. Fortunately, there was a sprinkler system installed, but still one person sadly died, was overcome by smoke coming in from outside. And that's a pretty rare fire, really, where you're trying to protect people from fires outside the building. We're usually trying to protect people inside the building. but the sprinklers did prevent the spread of fire. We strongly recommend that where any underground car park is being considered or constructed below residential accommodation, that car park must be sprinkler protected. And I'm going to use those words, must be sprinkler protected. I think even government now accepts the guidance in approved document B regarding car parks is woefully out of date. Currently, that guidance does not recommend sprinklers. It believes that cross ventilation would be satisfactory. And clearly, the types of fires we're now getting, that is inappropriate. This is a good example. Again, I think this was sheltered housing in Hertfordshire, where a developer wanted to build beyond what we call the 45-metre rule. The 45-metre rule is about the distance a fire appliance needs to get to the footprint of a new building. And when you're building up in these infill developments, it is sometimes difficult to have a suitable access roadway for a fire appliance to get within that distance. However, increasingly we are seeing that building control are accepting that if a sprinkler system is installed, that rule can be extended. And in fact, now, if you look at British Standard Treble 91, that allows for up to 90 metres. So that's an incredible opportunity to be able to build where previously you would not have been able to build without perhaps installing a new access road for fire appliances. A considerable cost saving if you put sprinklers in. We're all seeing the growing problem, I think, of mobility scooters, especially in residential care situations. And a number of fires have occurred, some with fatal consequences. This is a fire in Sheffield where you can clearly see a lot of smoke damage to the corridor. And questions arise, well, what can we do with mobility scooters? Interestingly, the Building Research Establishment, again in conjunction with one of BAFSA's members, conducted some studies. And it's well worth you looking at that document if you are considering allowing people to have mobility scooters inside residential premises. Because the tests that were conducted down at the Building Research Establishment proved that a sprinkler system will suppress a fire in a mobility scooter and will even suppress fires in a mobility scooter storage unit. And I know of a number of housing providers in the London area that now insist on sprinklers in stores where they're actually charging mobility scooters. London Fire Brigade looked at the problem of hoarding, and this is a difficult issue, and I've actually dealt myself with when I was in the fire service with a number of these problems, particularly of elderly people that have got this desire to hoard materials. Of course, if a fire occurs, we've got a tremendous amount of fuel, and that can cause a severe risk, not just to the tenant, but the rest of the building. London did a number of tests using sprinklers, and yet the sprinklers can do a job. Importantly, though, be careful, because we need to make sure that we've got a good water supply, possibly a better water supply than the standard would normally require. When the water supply was stopped in these trials, after 10 minutes, the fire continued to grow. And another point I should mention, particularly to consultants and enforcing officers, is we do not believe water mist is a suitable fire suppression system for any property where there's a risk of hoarding. Lots of changing attitudes post-Grenfell, of course. We've got the various reviews going on. And I want to just mention Dame Judith Hackett's report, because this does touch on a number of issues related to sprinklers, not just cladding, I think other matters related to fire safety. And I would emphasise the issue of competency. BAFSA is investing a tremendous amount of time, effort and money into ensuring that our members, the actual workforce, are competent to install sprinklers. and also design sprinkler systems. And we believe that this is important to make sure that all our systems are fit for purpose. I would also mention the issue of testing. I've already said that building regulations doesn't want to restrict the issue of innovation. However, you need to make sure that anything you are installing as life safety under the building regulation has been properly tested in realistic situations. And this is something that the Hackett report again picks up on. We need proper testing to prove that these products work. And I am seeing a lot of new inventions coming along, which is questionable whether they have been tested as we would like. So something to bear in mind if you are looking to install sprinklers that's probably not to the British standard. Always important to know that you need a competent contractor. And how do you know a contractor is competent? Well, it's simply asking, are you a member of a third-party certification scheme? And these are the schemes that we have for sprinkler systems in the UK. And all BAFSA members must be certificated with one of these schemes. What that does is give you an independent assessment of the contractor and their capabilities and competence. And most importantly, if you're the responsible person, you will get a certificate of conformity at the end of that project. And that really is an important document for you. You can show that you have shown due diligence in installing that form of fire protection in your building. A lot of challenges to fire safety as we go forward. We know we've got an ageing population. We need more access and egress for infirm and disabled people, more so than we've had in the past. We have the challenge of modern methods of construction. We've seen a lot of timber frame projects. I've already mentioned we want more open plan living and flexible design. We're building on smaller footprints, but we're building taller. Also, don't forget, we've got changes to the fire service. And we might not like this, but this has been happening now for a number of years, where we have call challenging policies and changes to attendances of fire and rescue resources. So perhaps you need to think about that in your emergency plan. And again, I believe sprinklers can really help with that. So they can be your solution to many of your problems, provided they're properly designed and installed by competent contractors. And just to finish off, we've now got a review, another review of approved document B about to commence. And we may well stick with an awful lot of traditional methods. I'd point out, well, I'd rather have a modern sprinkler system than the traditional fire escape from some of these properties. I'm sure you'd do likewise. The other thing to bear in mind is, whilst we're focusing on review of building regulations, that's about buildings that are not yet built. There are many existing buildings. I think that we need to consider, have we got the right form of fire protection in those buildings for the type of people we're now looking after? And with that, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ian. And now, in advance of our final presentation, I have some questions to ask you. Julian Tranter asks, did the care homes have addressable fire alarms?
I couldn't, I'm not sure what care homes you may be talking about. Some probably will, but I wouldn't know. Under certainly approved document B for England and Wales for some years, sheltered housing are supposed to have a form of automatic call facility, but one couldn't say what was in those homes.
I think
I don't know if Keith knew about Rose Park. That is, right. Is it about Rose Park?
I think it was actually referring to the care homes that you mentioned in your presentation.
There would be a variety of standards in those homes.
Also, can you answer, does the sprinkler activate on false fire alarms?
No, that's the beauty of a sprinkler system. It has to have a real fire. There's very few electronic components to a sprinkler system. So false alarms are very few and far between, and it really needs physical damage to a sprinkler head to get it to operate when there isn't a fire.
Right. And now this is specifically about the block in Northampton you spoke about being fully up to regulation and would still have been today. But you felt the doors to the flats did not do their jobs in containing the fire in the flat. Were the doors FD30 fire rated or not, of a fire resisting material?
The doors were alleged to be fire rated and would have been considered so when the building was constructed. One of the issues for those doors were that they were fitted with rising butt hinges, which was allowable back then. In fact, today, we don't require any closing devices on our fire doors in 3-storey dwellings. So one could argue it had a better form of fire protection back then. But those rising butt hinges on the door to the room of origin didn't allow the door to completely close. What was left, quite frankly, was a bit of timber around the hinges. The fire door had completely gone, and the fire had gone through the floor and the roof. And that's not uncommon in a house fire.
Right. Well, thank you very much, Ian. We'll hear more from you later. And now for our second poll, we ask, will you consider fitting sprinklers in your premises? And just to let you all know, we will send everyone a link to the recording of this webinar within the next couple of days. And now here is Alan Crichton, Chairman of the BAFSA Technical Committee.
My name is Alan Crichton. I am the Technical Chairman for BAFSA, and I am also the main trainer for BAFSA too. Today we're going to talk about sprinkler design in care homes. So, care homes and sheltered housing have the most vulnerable people in our society. So isn't it right that we protect them from the effects of fire? Vulnerable people are considered to have a higher likelihood of having a fire, and this can also be compounded with poor reaction or realisation of the danger presented by fire, or likelihood of both. For instance, along with that, you have additional fire risks such as oxygen, in care homes and sheltered housing, but also you have got mobility scooters too, and other things that present a hazard. So they need to be taken into account when you're designing a sprinkler system. Okay. An annual fire risk assessment should be carried out to determine whether the property is safe from fire. So this should be checking fire compartmentation, fire doors, fire alarm systems, also the fire management plan, and you need to check if the building's been maintained properly. You might not have a sprinkler system at that point, but it may be highlighted that a sprinkler system should be put in. So even though fire alarms will alert residents at an early stage of a fire, the realisation or reaction time might not be sufficient to protect the residents from the effects. Sprinkler systems will protect the residents at an early stage and save lives. For instance, we have this little diagram here. As you can see, between a minute and a half, your smoke detection will go off, and if you've got sprinklers, that's when your sprinklers will activate. And during that time, the sprinklers will control the fire until the fire brigade get there. If you don't have sprinklers, the fire will continue to grow. Within 2 to 3 minutes, the odds of escaping are decreased significantly, and like we said, with reaction times or realisation, that may be easily within that before the elderly residents actually realise that there is a fire. Okay, so when you get to about 3 to 5 minutes, you're looking at flashover, and it could be a case of no one surviving. Right. Within 8 minutes to 10 minutes, if you're not in a rural location, you may have a fire brigade that gets there quick enough to get water on the flames. Okay, so that just gives you a small indication of where sprinkler systems can be handy and where they can put fires out. So what I'm going to do is expel some myths. They all go off at once. But like this. Oh, no, that's an American film. That's not the case. Okay. What you get, you've got a sprinkler head that looks something like this. And the sprinkler head has a bulb in it. And in that bulb, that is a frangible bulb, which compromises of thermal liquid, which will expand on a set temperature. And at that set temperature, it'll burst the glass and then release the water from the sprinkler head, and then basically put water on the fire and either control it or extinguish it. So here we have just a little room with some sprinkler heads in it. So for instance, if we get a fire here, the heat between the fire at that point is more than likely going to set off 4 sprinkler heads, and they 4 sprinkler heads will contain the fire until the fire brigade get there. So they don't all go off at once. So what we've got, we'll go back to the sprinkler head itself. The frangible bulb is generally set 20 degrees above the ambient temperature of the room. And the bulb is set within a brass seating, holding back the pressurised water. And what happens is when the bulb bursts, it releases the brass seating and then the water comes out. So like that, you can see the brass sealant going and then the water coming out. And that gives you an umbrella effect and gives you coverage of the head to deal with the fire at that point. So another myth is sprinkler systems are expensive. Not the case again. It's estimated that the sprinkler system cost can be recovered over a period of 10 years. Okay, potentially through insurance premiums and, well, obviously disruptive business continuity. For instance, in a care home, if you have a fire without a sprinkler system, you've lost pretty much a good part of the building. If you've got a sprinkler system and there is a fire in a room, that will be contained within that room. Yes, you might have some clean-up costs, but realistically, you could probably have that room turned round in a week and put back together so that you can rent it back out again. Okay, so water damage is as bad as fire damage, another myth. Typical sprinkler discharges about 60 litres per minute. A firefighter's hose will discharge 600 litres per minute. So the water damage is definitely going to be worse if the fire brigade get there. And at the end of the day, water damage can be resolved or it can be fixed. Fire damage can't. So, actual designs in care homes. At the moment, sprinkler system designs in care homes are covered by BS 9251 2014. Okay, however, these are due for an update this year around probably May. Okay, some insurance companies might actually ask for commercial rules to protect the building before they'll actually insure it. So that's something you need to take up with your insurance company. So again, when you design a sprinkler system, you need to allocate the category of that system, and that category will affect the amount of heads in operation. It will also affect the duration of the system, which can affect the size of the pumping tank. Okay. So they're listed in Table 1. So as you can see, if you look at Category 2, you've got small residential care premises with 10 or fewer residents, right? And then Category 3, you've got large care premises. Now, when you are designing these, you've got to take into account the vulnerability of the people in the care home. And it may be that you need to increase the category system due to the maybe end-of-life care or whatever it is that you've got in there. You might actually want to add additional pumps, maybe a larger tank, just to make sure that you're getting proper protection. But that's all something that can be done at consultancy stage. Okay, so we're going to run through this. So a single family dwelling So we've got an elderly person who's got some issues in a single family dwelling. He stayed there all his life with his family, and the council have decided to put a sprinkler system in. So generally that'll be a category 1 system. However, when you walk in the house, you see this kind of thing: alcohol, cigarettes. So you've seen fire risks all over the place. You know, it's also worthwhile looking at the cooker. There may be some scorch marks in the cooker that show that he's had some potential fires there before. Okay, so in this instance, you would probably want to increase it to category 2. Now, all that does for category 1 to category 2 is increase the density somewhat, just a little bit, and it increases the time. So for a category 1 system, it's 10 minutes in operation. For a category 2, it's 30. Okay, and you get that from table 2. So in table 2, as you can see, you get the minimum discharge density at 2.4 for a category 1, 1 or 2 heads in operation, and that all depends on the size of your room. If your room needs 2 heads to give you the proper coverage, you need to include 2 heads in the calculation. If it's only 1 head, 1 head. Okay, and you see the difference there: 10 minutes supply for a category 1 system, 30 minutes supply for a category 2, and when you get up to a category 3 system, 2 to 4 heads. So in a large care home, where you've got an area where they like to, where you've got an area where you've got a TV or socialising area, you might have 4 heads that need to be calculated at that point for 30 minutes. Okay, so heads will give you a depth of water known as the density. For instance, 2.04 millimetres per minute over the floor. So basically, over a minute, in a room, you would have 2.4 millimetres of water. But the system doesn't stop there. What we're actually trying to do is wet the walls from 700 down from the ceiling. Okay, so when you get a sprinkler system, for a category 1, it's 2.04 millimetres of water on the carpet over a minute, and it covers up to 700 below the ceiling. And the duration for a cat 1 system is 10 minutes, for instance. Okay. So you've got to remember, when we're classifying the category, you've got to remember special circumstances that may require the category to be increased, affecting the density, heads in operation, and duration of supply. So for small care homes, less than 10 residents, it's category 2. So that would be 1 to 2 heads in operation. Okay, as I said, it depends on the heads in the room, the fire rating of the room. Heads will give a depth of water of 2.8 millimetres a minute and up to 700 below the ceiling, and the duration of that system would be 30 minutes. Okay, and again, remember special circumstances. So the special circumstances are, you may have an industrial kitchen in a category 2 system which is doing meals and wheels, and that kitchen may be an increased fire risk. For category 3 systems, 2 to 4 heads in operation. Okay, I'll give you 2.8 millimetres on the floor with a duration of 30 minutes. Now, what does this all mean? Basically, your sprinkler heads is pressurised, usually about 5 bar of water. So it's usually about 5 bar of water in the pipe up to the brass seating. Okay, at that point there. So what you get a pressure at the head, and a pressure at the head will give you a flow of water, approximately 60 litres per minute per head. Therefore, the approximate water discharge from a category 1 system, which may be 2 heads, is 120 litres. Category 2 system, say, and again 120 litres. Category 3 system would be 4 heads, that's probably double at 240. Your hydraulic calculations would determine that though. Okay. So pipe work. So when you get the town's main or pump feed coming in, you'll have a stop valve, which is this here. Usually looks something like that. This is called a resi riser. You've got a check valve, which stops the water flowing back into the main street or back to the pump. You get a flow switch there, which gives an indication of flow of water. So that sends a signal to the fire alarms, which ultimately sends a signal to the alarm receiving centre. You've then got a pressure gauge and a test and drain line. At that point, you should be hard piping your test and drain line to outside, so that if there is an emergency and you have got a burst head, you can shut the system isolation valve and open up the test drain line and reduce the water out of the system quickly. Okay. Now that little blue thing, the drain test line, on the drain test line is for testing the sprinkler system. So what you'll have there is a little T-piece that you can put a flow meter into. So every year when you come to do the maintenance, you can test the flow and pressure from the incoming supply, and it can be plugged off. Again, last but not least, the cable from the flow switch to the fire alarm panel has to be agreed at tender stage who's actually going to do that. Okay, so that's generally what it looks like. When you've got a booster pump, so a booster pump will boost the pressure of the town's main supply, but it won't boost the flow. So if you've got enough flow in the street, you can put a booster pump in. You don't need a tank. Increases the pressure of the incoming main. Okay, the minimum requirements to use is set out by the manufacturer. So you need to have the appropriate flow for your system after your hydraulic calculations to use this. But you also need to check that it's approved by the local water authority. Okay. And then you've got, finally, the most common one, which is a pump and tank system. You would use a pump and tank system when you're not getting enough flow and pressure from the street. So approximate tank sizes for a Cat 1 system may be 1200 litres. Cat 2 system 3600, the Cat 3 possibly about 8000. That can vary depending on the size of the building and the calculations. Okay, so what you've got is a suction pipe going to the pump, and then the pump feeds the system like it was in a Resi riser, exactly the same. But at that point there, you've actually got a pipe coming from the pump straight back into the tank, and what that does, it allows you to flow the water from the pump back into the tank in a big loop, and at that point you can test the flow and pressure. Okay, so after you get a fire, you'll get a signal from the flow switch to the fire alarm panel, and the fire alarm panel would go to the alarm receiving centre, which may be off-site, Redcare, something like that. So documents and labels. It's important to label up your sprinkler system, because when you've got a maintenance provider who's coming in after somebody else has installed it, he needs to know the information so you can check your system's actually fit for purpose. So he needs to be able to see a logbook, an operating and maintenance manual, signs and labels on the system, basically telling them what things are, stop valve, pump, etc, etc. And the most important thing of all is that you need to have a system data label, and that's generally put at the pump or at the residential riser. Okay, that tells the maintenance contractor what flows and pressure he needs for the system to work properly. If that's not there, it becomes really difficult, and it may cost you money to get it redesigned. So maintenance purposes, sprinkler maintenance should be carried out a minimum once per year. So that includes a visual inspection of the system, all areas of the property. You need to check the water supplies, including the flow tests, which tells you if you get enough flow and pressure for the pump or the town's main supply. And that's us. So hopefully that's been helpful. It's a very broad brush approach to it. So if you want to get in contact with me to ask any questions, I'm sure you can do so. Alrighty. So you can put your questions to Wendy, and I'm sure she'll ask me.
Thank you very much, Alan. Before we address some of the many questions we have received, here are the results of our second poll. We asked, will you consider fitting sprinklers in your premises? And 91% of you said yes, whereas 9% said no. Thank you very much for that. We will not be able to answer all your questions online, but we will address them and come back to you directly over the next week with answers to your questions if they are not answered in the following session. Now, I would like to invite all our panelists to come back, Alan, Keith, and Ian, and we will address some questions. Thank you very much. Right, an anonymous attendee has asked, given the pending changes with the imminent fire safety bill with respect to residential domestic flats and the spotlight that has been put on external wall systems post-Grenfell, would you consider sprinkler systems a suitable compensatory factor for a wall system that does not have fire breaks in? Or would a remedy to the external walls also be required? Gentlemen.
I'll have a go at that. That's a very good question. And of course, it would depend on the type of cladding that one has on that building. I think in the interim, post-Grenfell, BAFSA's view and my personal view, certainly, was that a sprinkler could have done something to slow that fire down. And I base that upon evidence from other fires abroad, particularly in the Middle East, where similar types of fires have occurred, but those buildings were sprinkler protected and it didn't result in death or injury to occupants. Of course, you might still lose the building, but I think it could do something with regards to life safety. And I'd be interested to hear what other members of the panel might think about that.
Thanks, Ian. Yeah, certainly I saw the fires in the Middle East and the Emirates, and where sprinklers did actuate and they did slow down the spread of fire and allowed people to escape. Whether that would have been the same at Grenfell is a matter of debate. Certainly the buildings in the Middle East were far newer. They're in a good state of maintenance. What the conditions are in Grenfell or were in Grenfell, I have no idea. But certainly it is a good discussion point.
Well, thank you. So, do the sprinklers activate due to smoke or heat?
They only activate due to heat.
Right, that's a quick one. What sealants or fire stopping should be used around the sprinkler pipework that penetrates separating walls? Thank you, Alan.
Each manufacturer of CPVC or other types of plastic piping recommends their own type of sealant or another manufacturer's type of sealant, and you must comply with what they recommend. Those are the only two that go together, the one they recommend to go with their pipework.
Alan, did you have anything to add to that?
No.
No. Okay. Mark Huntington asks, do the sprinkler heads actuate early enough to protect the resident of the room where the fire has originated, especially where it's a smouldering fire? Or is there an expectation that the fire alarm would provide early warning and the resident assisted to escape before the sprinkler actuates?
Sprinklers aren't there to deal with smouldering fires because that fire needs to reach a temperature around about 68 degrees at the head for the head to operate. That's quite hot. So no, sprinklers can't deal with smouldering fires. That is why the Building Research Establishment in their document that I mentioned said you must still have smoke detection for those, in fact, many fires that start as slow smouldering fires and then might grow into larger ones. So still need smoke detection, and the sprinkler is there to really stop the flashover. That's what the Americans said right at the beginning of the development of residential sprinklers. And as a firefighter, to me, it's that flashover that causes death and injury to so many people in homes. So you still need smoke detection.
Thank you, Ian. Another one. Children's care homes are popping up regularly now, utilising former domestic dwellings and being registered with the care inspectorate as care homes. Building standards don't see this as a change of use, but clearly they are changing the type of occupancy which would bring it into the scope of a change of use. Therefore, sprinklers should be fitted. Bearing in mind, I don't know where this area is because unfortunately this was an anonymous question. There were 3 fires in 3 different local authorities owned by children's care homes, all of which had sprinklers fitted and actually put the fires out. Surely work must be done to stop this loophole. I think the change of occupancy is the...
I don't think any of us can talk about what any particular building control authority may or may not do. That's a matter for them. But I mean, the question is right. The risk has changed, but what then kicks in would be the fire safety order or the fire safety legislation or the parts of the UK, and it'd be down to your risk assessment. So the responsibility shifts to the responsible person. And we have had fatal fires in children's homes, of course. And I know at least one coroner has recommended that sprinklers be fitted in all children's homes.
Thank you, Ian. Steve Tebow asks, residential care home sprinkler systems are normally designed to BS 9251 2014, which we know is currently under review. Are there any situations whereby a residential sprinkler system would need to be required to BSEN 12845?
Alan might have a view on that, but I struggle to think of one.
Yeah, it would all depend on the fire risk and the occupancy. And at the end of the day, the insurance company of the care home, they might decide that they'll be happy with BSEN 12845. So it depends on the building, and it depends on the insurance company.
Right.
Some
Thank
insurance.
you.
Yeah.
Crystal Young asks, the kitchen and right next to the front door, the fire exit is through the kitchen. What should you do in case of a fire if the fire blocks all exits?
Well, I mean, all I can talk about is that a means of escape shouldn't go through a higher risk area. And that's been rules for many, many years, both in England and I'm sure in Scotland. But at the end of it all, if there's no other way out in that particular situation, you're going to have to look at windows, which is not what we want to do at all.
So Mark Thompson asks, are sprinkler systems in care homes classed as domestic systems or commercial?
Residential.
Yeah.
Right. Quick answer. Is there a risk of Legionella associated with sprinkler systems?
No, there's no risk of Legionella at all. Worldwide, there has been a desk research project, and Legionella has not been connected with any sprinkler actuation worldwide.
Thank you. How do sprinklers deal with fires that might be beneath a kitchen worktop?
It would all, I mean, it depends. The fire would just build up underneath a kitchen worktop and eventually come through. So the sprinklers would contain it within that area until the fire brigade get there and they can deal with it. You've got to remember, sprinklers are designed to suppress fires until they can get extinguished by the fire brigade. They're not actually designed to extinguish the fire. So they would contain the fire until it can be dealt with.
You'll also get early warning from the heat detector. If you live in Scotland or Wales, where a heat detector is now required in the kitchen, but it will give you an early warning that there is a fire in your kitchen.
Thank you very much. We have had many more questions. Andrea Lucarini asks, sprinklers would require some time to activate from the hot gases produced by the fire, and this depends on the fire size and location of the fire relative to the sprinkler head. So at the time of sprinkler activation, smoke is already expected to be able to spread in the building. How would you solve this, in particular in stay-put strategies? Wouldn't a smoke extraction system be a better solution?
I think in care homes as well, you have smoke stop doors and fire doors fitted. One of the problems in the Rose Park incident was that the fire doors were kept open at night in order that staff could check on the residents without disturbing them. Had all the fire doors been kept shut in Rose Park, there was a good possibility that the majority of the residents would have survived. So the doors stop the spread of the smoke out with the room of origin. Obviously, the alarm, the smoke detection will actuate, giving an early warning, and when the heat becomes sufficient, the sprinkler system will actuate. In terms of using smoke extraction, it's not normally used in that type of premises. Clearly, you could have a fire engineered solution using sprinklers and smoke extraction, but it would have to be very carefully calculated how that would work, because one could work against the other.
Yeah, Keith, on that, it's the hot gases and the smoke that set off the sprinkler head. So if you're extracting the smoke, the fire could grow and overwhelm the sprinkler system. The thinking behind it is that the smoke extraction system will operate once the sprinklers have operated. So the flow switch on the sprinkler system would then start up the smoke extraction and deal with it that way. So the sprinklers are already dealing with the fire and also drawing out the smoke. So that's the way it should be designed.
Jonathan James wonders whether you'd like to talk about the differences for life safety and property protection systems, the differences between. Is there something somebody would like to take up?
There isn't really anything in the BS 9251 separating both. It's the one type of system and that's it. If you want to enhance your system, like a life safety, you'll be adding additional pumps, additional tanks. It's really just to keep the system operating while you're doing the maintenance. That's where your life safety comes in. So it's just additional measures, and you would have to take guidance from BS EN 12845 for that.
Well, I think, thank you very much indeed. And thank you very much for all of our participants for staying with us. And I hope you have found this beneficial. We will be putting a recording to you all next week, and we will address some more of your questions. Keith, may I hand you over for a final few thoughts and words?
Sure. Thank you very much, Wendy. Just one point that came up during one of the presentations. Can I point out that IFCC also have third-party certification for water mist installers as well. Thank you very much to Alan, Wendy and Ian for providing the presentations and setting us up today. And thank you very much to everybody for attending. Please consider fitting sprinklers to your care homes, sheltered housing and specialised housing, and do use a system that complies with the British standard, and do use third-party certified installers. Thank you very much for everybody attending, and look out for our next presentations, which should be in May.